Thank you, Beth and Bob, and all of you for being here. I haven't been to Madison for a while, so it's fun to be here, and I'm happy to be able to spend some time with you and talk with you today. I'm going to give a fairly formal presentation because I have some points that I really want to make, and if I don't write them down, they'll spin out of control and you won't know what I'm talking about. So I do apologize in advance for reading some of this, but I hope the message is clear. Another thing, I mentioned this to Beth last night, that I thought this was kind of a depressing talk, and the reason is because I think that anthropology of education, sociology of education, and ethnography of education in general is a project of critique, and that makes for some not always happy results or findings, and I'm going to talk about some of those things today. Okay, to begin then, difference and inequality are foundational to educational ethnography in the United States. In schools and other educational contexts, difference and inequality are continually being marked, staged, recorded, interpreted, negotiated, manipulated, and contested. By directing attention to difference and inequality, educational ethnography has provided a consistent alternative to much U.S. educational research. Most of the research in education in the U.S. focuses mostly on working within rather than seriously questioning or challenging the prevailing structures, organizations, and ideologies of American education and schools. Ethnography, educational ethnography, I think, has been a contrast to this. And since the 1950s, at least, let's see if this, and I quote here, educational ethnographers have searched for ways to conceive and confront the institutional arrangements that have turned schools against children and teachers. They've expressed outrage about what gets done in the name of schooling, a skepticism about the received categories that make it easy to mismeasure kinds of children and kinds of learning, a distrust of national efforts to change and reform, and they've given attention to real people in action as the site for the drama of schooling to reveal its connections to ongoing inequalities and injustices. In this presentation, I'm going to draw attention to 5 themes in the way I think U.S. ethnographers have framed the conversation about difference and inequality over the past several decades. Some of these framings emerged much earlier than others, but I think all 5 remain thematic in educational ethnography today. There are, of course, other themes that I might have highlighted, but I think these 5 have been especially influential. And I'm going to review these themes rather quickly and talk about some of the ways that my own work has represented them, and also the way other people's work has represented them. So the first theme that I want to draw your attention to is cultural difference and unequal school performance. This framing of the conversation became prominent in the 1950s when educational anthropology emerged as a subfield of U.S. cultural anthropology. At the time, most anthropologists conceived of culture as an adaptive collective response to particular environmental, social, economic, political, and historical conditions. That response was a distinctive way of life, a culture, including characteristic institutions, social arrangements, survival strategies, child rearing practices, values, beliefs, language, customs, and so forth. Cultural differences arose when groups faced different conditions, and these differences were maintained as long as the response to those conditions remained adaptive. Although cultures were different, none was inherently or universally better adapted. Some were better adapted to particular circumstances, than others, including the fact that some were more successful at colonizing or dominating than others were. In the US context, Native Americans, non-Protestant, non-white, religious, ethnic, and racial groups, recent immigrants, non-English speakers, and poor people came to be marked in various ways over time as culturally different from the American norm. As groups, those who fit the norm tended to have greater wealth and power, including the power to control schooling and to label the other and to enforce the notion of difference. In this view of culture and cultural difference, children acquire culture from child-rearing practices at home and in the neighboring communities. Different child-rearing practices produce different patterns of behavior, beliefs, language use, and normative expectations. Sometimes these cultural practices and patterns match or closely overlap with those of the schools, and sometimes they don't. Many of the best-known ethnographers of education today have conducted research in schools and classrooms to document the effects of cultural differences on school performance and outcomes. So you will probably recognize some of these works. Shirley Bryce Heath's very famous Ways with Words. Norma Gonzalez and Luis Moll's Funds of Knowledge. These and many other works are in this tradition. I would summarize this by saying that this theme, as ethnographers have found that when behaviors and norms expected and learned at home align with those expected at school, students are likely to do well in school. When these behaviors and norms do not align and go unrecognized or in some cases demeaned, students are likely to do poorly in school through no fault of their own. In consequence, educational ethnographers have repeatedly argued that mainstream schools should be changed to value and accommodate cultural differences so that non-dominant students could feel more comfortable, teachers could better understand those students, and non-dominant students could do better in school. Some policies, schools, curricula have been developed in accord with this recommendation, but sadly, most have not. The effort to make schooling more culturally situated, relevant, sensitive, responsive for non-dominant students endures to this day, including in the work of some of your faculty here, Gloria Ladson-Billings, Carl Grant, others. And the first ethnographic study that I ever contributed to began with this framing. I was a graduate student working with two young anthropology professors. We applied for and won a federal grant to study school desegregation in the South. This was in the mid-1970s. We proposed a 2-year ethnographic study of social relationships in a newly desegregated elementary school. And the school that we studied went from 100% white to 65% black in the summer right before we started our study. At the same time, the administration and the faculty remained predominantly white. And what we set out to explore were how cultural differences between the black students and their white teachers manifested in the school, and how the teachers and students negotiated this unfamiliar terrain under court-ordered desegregation. And this is just a picture of some of the kids from that study. We ended up writing a book-length manuscript illustrating how black-white relations at the school produced what we called a veneer of harmony, in which an image of the school as one big happy family was presented to the public, while the tensions and struggles of black-white desegregation were carefully controlled internally in ways that prevented them from being openly discussed, interrogated, or ameliorated, leaving students and staff isolated by racial group and by student or teacher group and on their own to make sense of what was going on in this unfamiliar context. School desegregation, intended to overcome long-standing racial divisions and attendant inequalities, was undermined on the ground of schooling practices that took little or no account of what students or staff would really have to do in order to alter the legacy of black-white differences and inequalities in the South. So that's my first theme. The second theme I call social and cultural reproduction in schools. This framing of the conversation about difference and inequality came to the fore in the 1970s and 80s with the work of British ethnographers of education, such as Stuart Hall and Paul Willis, French sociologists like Pierre Bourdieu, and American sociologists of ed like your own Michael Apple and also Lois Weiss. Their work encouraged educational ethnographers to examine the ways in which schools are organized to produce and reproduce consent for inequalities through such things as unequal structural arrangements like tracking, curriculum differentiation of various kinds, and special education and other programs like that. And also through institutionalized discourses of difference, such as those that construct fast or slow readers, learning disabled students, English language learners, the urban poor, and of course, minority students. These researchers exposed underlying inequalities in the way students were grouped, sorted, and labeled in schools, the ways knowledge was embedded and privileged in curricula, and the ways resources and rewards were distributed across schools and classrooms. Because for the most part, these features of schooling are accepted or taken for granted as just the way school is, they are not often challenged, and thus they reproduce difference and inequality on a daily basis in schools. An extension of this framing appeared in the influential book by Paul Willis, Learning to Labor, which you may know. He argued that some students, even though they are in a context that tends to reproduce inequalities and difference, some students don't accept these categories, and they resist or oppose what the school is, the way the school is categorizing them and treating them. And Willis wrote about students, and I quote, "They are social agents who are not passive bearers of ideology, but active appropriators who reproduce existing structures through struggle, contestation, and a partial penetration of the structures," unquote. In other words, students' responses to demeaning and stratifying institutional features in discourse could vary from practices of acceptance to practices of resistance to practices of opposition and innovation, making social and cultural reproduction likely but not certain. About this second framing of the conversation, Fred Erickson has written, and I quote here, "The shift in understanding of culture from a tightly integrated set of rules learned in childhood to a more flexible array of principles for action, belief, and desire, which are then enacted adaptively and opportunistically in practice, became a fundamental change in American anthropology and in culture theory. In the dialectic between schooling's institutional categories and individual or group responses to those categories, social hierarchies and discourses of educational and individual difference usually are reproduced, but various outcomes are possible." If you know Willis's book, the lads in the book did not accept the school's positioning of them, but in rejecting it, they acted in ways that ended up reproducing their working class status. This framing, the social and cultural reproduction plus Willis's addition to it, informed my second ethnographic study, which was of black and white college women who, as freshmen, intended to pursue non-traditional careers and subject areas and careers for women. This was an 8-year longitudinal ethnographic study in which we followed a small group of women, half of whom were at a historically black university and half at a historically white university, as they moved through college and into their adult lives. It eventually resulted in the book Educated in Romance, which I'm really glad I contributed to writing this book, because it's the most famous thing that I've done. And it's been all downhill since then. Nobody cares about most of the rest of my work. This is the one that's garnered all the attention. Anyway, this book revealed how a peer-dominated culture of romance on both of the campuses undermined aspirations to overcome the gender status quo in adult employment and lifestyle for the women that we followed. So although it is the case that we, Willis, and many others have found students eventually reproducing a status quo despite moments of resistance or opposition, there is still an impulse within ethnography to, or there has been a growing impulse, I think, to find some or more of these moments in which opposition and resistance somehow takes hold. And there's a nice quote from Bradley Levinson and Dottie Holland about this, in which they write that schools can create a space for the formation of social relations among people of different classes, genders, castes, ethnic, and age groups, which would be unlikely in other sites. Such relations may come to reconfigure previous alliances, allegiances, and sympathies. Thus, schools provide each generation with social and symbolic sites where new relations, new representations, new knowledges can be formed, sometimes against, sometimes tangential to, sometimes coincident with the interests of those holding and wielding power. Now, identifying and revealing the transformative or transgressive possibilities suggested by theories of social and cultural reproduction has recently become much more salient in ethnographic work, especially work that focuses on young people, particularly teenagers, and work that's done by critical scholars of color and those doing participatory action research. So this is my third theme, which I call Spaces of Youth Resistance. These studies interrogate the social, political, economic, and moral climates that create and sustain dominant practices and discourses, and work to invalidate local transgressive meanings and identities. But they do this by attempting to deconstruct these dominant practices and discourses and highlight the ways that young people try and sometimes succeed in resisting these systems of power, especially systems of capitalism, racism, sexism, and ageism. These studies demonstrate the often minute, in the shadows, and underground means by which young people express and sustain resistances to the categories of difference and inequality that they face. Moving on to the fourth theme, which I call Schools Entangled in Processes of Nationalism and Globalization. U.S. ethnographers of education have also been interested in the influences of nationalism and globalization on schools and local cultures. This work focuses on how circulating flows of capital and information, especially those under government, corporate, and media control, affect education and schooling in local places. In this framing, nationalizing and globalizing forces unsettle local practices, material and symbolic resources and processes, including representations of difference and inequality, that originate both distantly and locally, are mediated in schools. representations of difference and inequality naturalize, travel, and morph in layers and networks of local and translocal networks affecting education. And I would say that some of the work of your faculty, Leslie Bartlett, Amy Stambach, are representatives in my category scheme falling into this group. Studies of nationalizing and globalizing forces suggest the need for what George Marcus has called multi-sided ethnographies, which he describes, and I quote here, designed around chains, paths, threads, conjunctions, or juxtapositions of locations in which the ethnographer establishes some form of literal physical presence with an explicit positive logic of association or connection among sites that in fact defines the argument of the ethnography, unquote. The idea of ethnographically studying widely dispersed sites connected by forces of nationalism and globalization is provocatively illustrated in a book by anthropologist Anna Singh, which some of you may know, her 2005 book called Friction, an ethnography of global connection. It is a study of environmental and economic networks that affect the use of Indonesia's rainforests. About this work, she writes, quote, I search for odd connections. I focus on zones of awkward engagement where words, and one of her main examples in this book is the word frontier, where words mean something different across a divide, even as people agree to speak. These zones are transient. They arise out of encounters and interactions. They reappear in new places with changing events, unquote. Now, Singh's odd connections include those made, in her case, by local, national, and international environmentalists, research scientists, investors, large corporations, resource extraction advocates, United Nations funding agencies, mountaineers, village elders, and urban students, for each of whom the word frontier applied to the rainforest means something different. Large corporations and extraction advocates view the rainforest as a frontier that is largely unused, unexploited, and vacant, thus available for exploitation and profit. To villagers, the so-called frontier is their home, the source of their sense of place and their livelihood. For mountaineers and other tourists, the frontier is wild and uninhabited, a place to be enjoyed and preserved, not updated, modernized, or changed. So it's in these odd connections among these actors and the networks that bring them together in specific times and places that the evolving meanings and uses of this particular rainforest in Indonesia take shape. Jan Nesper's book, Tangled Up in School, is an illustration, an educational example of this kind of work. This book is an ethnographic examination originating in one elementary school, but moving beyond it to suggest how school district politics, regional economics, parental concerns, urban development, popular culture, gender ideologies, racial politics, and university and corporate agenda come together to construct educational contexts and produce educational effects in one particular elementary school. In Nesper's book, contested representations include the meaning of whole language instruction, the meaning of grades and how they're assigned, and the meaning of school business partnerships and how they get worked out. The result of his work, similar to Singh's, is not a coherent ethnography in the traditional sense. Instead, the book offers slices of perspective on experiences that make up a partial and often contradictory account of what is being produced and responded to in various sites of practice that are geographically and functionally distinct, but intersect via these networks of much wider scope. Viewed in this way, local struggles and practices of education exist in, contribute to, and are affected by multiple intersecting networks that connect widely dispersed people, sites, and representational technologies. To grasp why education, learning, achievement, difference, and inequality look the way they do in any given place and time, it's necessary to understand the many networks and intersections of which they are a part. So my final theme then is what I call enduring struggles brought to the present in educational practices and identity formation. This framing appears in educational ethnography inspired by the social practice theory of Dorothy Holland, Jean Lave, and their colleagues. The focus in this theory is on how persons produce their lives, their work, and their relationships as part of larger historical, political, economic, social, and cultural processes that take shape in local distinctive practices. According to the theory, enduring historical struggles as well as intimate identities are mediated through local practices. Thus, difference and inequality are products of encounters between people as they address and respond to each other under conditions of political, economic, and cultural historical concurrence. And these products may look and feel very different as people move from practice to practice in time and space. And about this practice, or about this framing, Holland and Lave write, and this is the second item here, quote, "Our approach has been to start with local struggles, that is, struggles in particular times and places, that trace out practices of identification, the relation of these practices to broader structural forces, and within that relational context, the historical production of persons and personhood." This framing was emergent in my 1998 book, Women's Science, where my colleagues and I reported on 4 studies of local practices in science and engineering groups that included women. This was also my attempt at doing a multi-sided ethnography, or one of my attempts. The practices that we studied here were a high school genetics classroom, a college engineering practicum, an environmental action group, and a nonprofit devoted to land conservation. At all the sites, girls and women were present in more than token numbers and were struggling to become known as scientists, or at least budding scientists and engineers in these contexts. As the women moved from novices to more experienced participants in each local practice, they formed successful identities as scientists or engineers. But they did so in ways that simultaneously marginalized them in relation to elite science or elite engineering professionals. The women could participate, they could learn, and they did thrive in various local practices of science and engineering. But they could not escape the translocal economic, political, and cultural forces that worked through these historically constituted local practices in ways that marginalized women. In Holland and Lave's book, History in Person, Lave used this framework to more fully explore how families living in a British enclave in Porto, Portugal, struggled with new identities for themselves and different futures for their children as the enclave school was caught up in a broader struggle between British expatriates who had lived in that region, or families had lived in that region, working, running the port trade business for many generations. And at the same time, new residents were coming in to work temporarily at multinational corporations that were locating in that same area. The British expats who were there viewed the elementary school as preparatory to sending their children to secondary school in England and then on into the English affluent classes. But the new families who were arriving to work at multinational corporations knew that they would only be there temporarily, and they wanted an international baccalaureate program in the school so that it would transfer for their kids when they moved away to another location, and probably another international location for them. And about this struggle, Lave wrote, and I quote here, "Changing relations between multinational corporate capitalism and perhaps the last gasp of an empire-based mercantile capitalism met in day-to-day conflict over the direction of schools in Porto. The families caught up in the conflict from their different economic, political, and social locations needed and wanted different kinds of preparation for their children's futures in the interest of forging both durable and new identities and life possibilities for the children." In women's science and in Lave's report of the struggle over this, the direction of this Porto school, enduring economic, social, and political differences and inequalities were brought to the present in local practices where new but related struggles arose, which then shaped contexts for new identity formations, some of which can, and in a few cases did, lead to some transformation. Okay, to begin to wrap up, I have taken my this label, New Landscapes of Inequality, from an edited book by Collins, DeLeonardo, and Williams, which they call New Landscapes of Inequality. This book focuses on ethnographies that emphasize the importance of understanding how difference and inequality are continually being formed and reformed, sometimes along familiar contours of ethnicity, language, gender, or class, and sometimes in what they call these new landscapes of inequality. These are landscapes that produce new forms of stigmatization. And this is a summary of their argument. New forms of stigmatization as when certain kinds of people receive new pejorative labels, such as illegal aliens or terrorists. Also where new forms of intimidation arise, such as when community panics arise over the local presence of homosexuals or mosques. Also new forms of legitimation, as when public schools and social services are defunded or working parents cannot make a living wage. Also new forms of pollution, as when oil and gas exploration or liquor stores are allowed near some schools but never allowed near others. And new forms of profit taking, as when bankers but not homeowners or shopkeepers are protected from risk. New landscapes of inequality also form in the shadow of success at overcoming some differences. Roger Lancaster has argued that in the US today, moral victories, such as when a few schools succeed in closing the achievement gap, are used to hide inequalities whose effects will emerge later. Inequalities such as resource differences among schools that compromise students' access to college despite achievement gains in the school. Equity-motivated practices to identify and remediate one difference can hide other inequalities with serious long-term consequences. Alfredo Artiles gave an example of just such a new landscape of inequality using the case of school services for special ed children. It's long been known that identification and placement in special ed directs resources and assistance to students who otherwise would not get them. But at the same time, this arrangement increases segregation, hardens stereotypes, strengthens bureaucratic control, and may disadvantage other students. Artiles shows how George Bush's highly touted No Child Left Behind law, which requires schools to disaggregate student achievement scores by race so that differences are clearly visible and can be monitored and addressed, has this kind of effect. NCLB promotes a reinvigorated justice agenda for schools, which is to reduce the achievement gap by race, but at the same time, it negatively recasts underperforming groups in terms of race and disability, tightening what he calls the race disability knot. It stigmatizes schools that may be doing other things well, and it diminishes teachers' autonomy and prerogative. Ong and St. Louis refer to this situation as the Janus-faced character of difference. While the recognition of difference may be salutary for equalization, this very move also incorporates difference within the existing framework of schooling, hence updating the inequalities that schooling instantiates rather than diminishing them. My current research is an attempt to understand in somewhat similar fashion new landscapes developing around the effort to produce more scientists and engineers in the US. In this context, the struggle is instantiated in multiple ways, including educational practices and policies intended to increase the number and diversity of young Americans who study science, engineering, technology, and mathematics, the so-called STEM fields. It's also instantiated in efforts to develop higher levels of proficiency and expertise in these STEM areas and to encourage more people to go into these fields, jobs, and careers. Encouraging more culturally diverse Americans and more Americans in general to pursue STEM fields is described as a national priority to improve global competitiveness by the possibility of developing innovations that the markets want and will pay for. It's also described as a national priority to protect national security so that we don't have to rely on foreign workers as much as we do to do sensitive jobs. It's also described as a way to decrease economic inequality because at least some STEM jobs are well-paying with projected availability and growth in the near future. Schools have been assigned the job of getting this work done. And I would say that arguably in improved and increased STEM education, especially for groups historically marginalized in the US economy, has become the primary focus of school reform in the US today. Thus, the push for STEM expansion and diversity has landed in schools and in the lives of many students and parents who have never considered and know very little about STEM jobs or careers. They have learned that they should want these things, but they're not at all sure what they are. I'm curious about the effects of this national rhetoric and the policies and programs flowing from it. And these are some of the questions that I have about this. What do these activities lead to, for whom, and at what cost? Who or what is being advantaged or disadvantaged? What happens on the ground for particular people and groups caught up in this social project? Now, clearly in this case, political rhetoric about economic competitiveness has been joined to a discourse about new opportunities, new economic opportunities for historically marginalized groups. The connection very nicely brings together two opposing streams in contemporary US politics. Those on the right, for whom economic growth is a priority, and those on the left, for whom equal opportunity and access is salient. However, policies motivated by this this emergent political discourse have, in actual fact, identified underrepresented groups already in college STEM for the lion's share of support and benefits. This group, which is historically quite small, so these are underrepresented students, underrepresented groups in STEM, people who have already begun college in a STEM field. This is where the benefits from this legislation or these policies have so far been directed. This group, historically quite small, can have only minimal effect on expanding and diversifying STEM. The much larger number of underrepresented high school students who demonstrate interest in STEM but do not pursue these fields in college is virtually ignored in this funding stream. Thus, by appropriating the discourse of STEM diversity, politicians and policymakers place themselves on the side of what is just and end up benefiting a few while simultaneously perpetuating the ongoing disadvantage of many. This is a moral victory of the kind that Lancaster is talking about, a moral accomplishment on behalf of equality that hides consequential inequalities. In my ongoing study, my colleagues and I are investigating how 50 high-achieving and low-income young women of color are experiencing this national agenda for STEM expansion and diversity in their high school and post-high school lives. We're finding that in many cases, these women's interests and accomplishments in STEM areas are made virtually invisible in the context of high school activities and college recruitment. Hardly anyone paid any attention to them. The young women found little or none of what Brandt and others have called sponsorship or legitimation for STEM interests and accomplishments, especially in engineering, physics, or chemistry. Few or limited scholarships were offered to them. No college recruiters came to call. No high school or college counselors stressed to them the special opportunities in fields like engineering. And this is in spite of the fact that these young women had demonstrated very high grades in high school math and science. Most had families who encouraged their STEM interests, at least in general. And further, all of the young women participated for 3 years in a high school after-school program that I and my team designed and ran, in which they initiated and carried out their own small-scale engineering projects. And clearly, all of them, had they gone into STEM, would have added diversity, at least superficially, to STEM. Yet only a handful of these high-achieving young women who had very good grades, had good ACT scores, had done actual engineering work, had worked with mentors who helped them learn more about engineering and help them with their engineering products. Only a handful of them actually went into college engineering or a non-medical science field. Some of them did not go to college at all. And those who did go to college in engineering or a non-medical science field, all but one switched out before the end of her freshman year. And I just wanna, these are some pictures of the young women who experienced this. So in conclusion, in the context of U.S. educational ethnography today, difference and inequality are understood as interactional accomplishments and representational technologies that can and do move back and forth across levels of activity, spaces of discourse, actors, and contexts. One group's advantage can be another group's disadvantage. Advantage in one case can mask disadvantage in another. Difference and inequality are constituted, marked, and transported to both positive and negative effect. Difference can garner resources, a positive outcome, but at the cost of negative stereotyping or segregation. Difference can mark and transport a valued identity, such as a good student identity, usually positive, or a devalued identity, such as a weak student identity, usually negative. Inequality, at least in the US, is almost always considered bad, unacceptable, and something to overcome, yet it can be manipulated in multiple ways to serve as the basis for action or inaction, to bolster or encumber claims, and to raise hope or diminish it. Difference and inequality are undertakings and tools that can be variously, multiply, flexibly, and strategically used to create an impression, make a point, gain ground, decide what to do next, rationalize what has already been done, and make numerous other social and cultural moves. Ethnographies of education teach us that difference and inequality are continually being constituted, produced, negotiated, and changed in ways that create rich and ever-changing contexts for investigation, reflection, and action. And in all of the cases I've described in this presentation, and there are many other examples I might have used, The processes of difference and inequality would not be seen, could not be interrogated, could not be addressed without the careful, in-depth work of educational ethnography. Thank you.